as I was preparing for this week, just we're going to look at 12 through 15. And there are some major things that happen in the life of Abram in this section. And so I was like, wow, there's just a lot. So I will post my notes. I might have to like skim and jump through a lot of stuff. But when I post my notes, you'll see there's a ton of footnotes in this one, a little more in depth. Um, if there's any resources that you're like when I'm talking through things, if you go back and look at the notes, if you want more information from those sources, then let me know and I can dig in a little bit more. Because some of these different commentaries, like when I'm preparing these, I try to do a general background commentary. I do a devotional commentary. I look at two preaching commentaries and then also one that is a little bit more academic. So I try to have a range of resources and that I could consult with as I'm preparing. And so some of these are really in depth. And so, so I'm just trying to make sure that I don't go too far into the weeds as we work through Genesis. But as we have been going through the history from Genesis 1 to Genesis 12, where we're picking up today, time just flies. The writer is going through epochs of time that are just like no time spent on them at all. Just go, 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 go. And now we're going to slow way down to Abram. And as we look through 12 through 15, we are introduced to Abram. His name means exalted father. Later, God will change his name to Abraham. And so even today, as I'm talking, like a couple weeks ago, I had a hard time with Moses and Noah. This time I can guarantee that I will most likely say Abraham while his name is still Abram. Same guy, but it's just default in my brain. So please forgive me ahead of time if I make those kinds of mistakes and errors this evening. We see that he is a man of faith as we meet Abram, and there's really not much that we know about him other than he's from Ur of the Chaldeans, which would have been in the land of Babylon. And so last week, him and his family moved from Ur to Haran, and they stayed there. And so now their initial plan was to go to Canaan, but they stopped in Haran. And so now we are picking up in that story in chapter 12, verse 1. And so as we read tonight, there's going to be large sections of scripture that we're going to read all at once just to get the narrative flow. But I will pause and mention things as we go. So let's just jump in. Chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there, he went on toward the hill east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. So, one of the things that we think about Abram, he's leaving the land that God had placed him in with his family. He's told to go and leave. And when I think about his life and just going into the unknown, he is this great example of faith. We know from the biblical record that the land that his family was from was steeped in idolatry, and so somehow Abram recognized that this God that was calling him was worth trusting. We don't know how. We don't know where this came from. We know from a couple weeks ago when we looked at the line of Shem, the people started calling on the name of the Lord. And so Abram is a part of the Shemite line. And so he is part of these descendants who called on the name of the Lord. But he's leaving everything he knows to go to the land that God had called him to in Canaan. And so he's abandoning the polytheism of his culture, and he's making a new path. And he doesn't debate, he doesn't argue, he doesn't question, he just goes. And as he's going, there's a promise that the Lord makes to Abram and these blessings. And in this first initiation of the Abrahamic covenant, we see the word bless used 5 times. God is going to bless Abram, going to bless his name, going to bless his family. He's going to bless all people who bless him, but also all nations will be blessed through him. And so Abram is, these are big promises to this man who, we just meet. We don't know why God chose him. We don't know what set him apart, but God chooses Abram to do this work, to make his family into a new nation. And through Abram and his descendants, we see this blessing is going to pass into all the nations. And so when we think about our own journey as followers of Jesus, the people of Israel were God's chosen nation. They were always intended to be a light to the nations. Even when we read through the law, we're going to see that the goal was not just to sequester Israel over to the side all by themselves. The goal of the law was to show the blessing of following the Lord. And so they were always supposed to be a blessing and an example to the world. And so as followers of Jesus today, we carry on, we're grafted into this promise of God's covenant to Abraham. And so we are still called to be a blessing to the world, that people would be blessed through us. But we're also part of the fulfillment of this covenant because we are part of those nations. All nations will be blessed through you. And so through Abraham's faithfulness, we are seeing part of the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant come to be. And when we are looking at the concept of blessing and cursing, we see like in creation, God said it was good. That's kind of a blessing statement. This is good. It is blessed. And in the fall, the curse is, even in the curses in Genesis 3, there are promises of hope. Whereas here, like the blessing and curse comparison is like, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, who speak against you, who work against you. Those people would be cursed. And as we are going to see even in the next little section here, that comes to pass. But part of Abraham's journey, there it is, the first one. Part of Abram's journey is learning to trust the Lord and not try to make God's plans come about in Abram's strength. And so we'll see that. Now, reading the story of Abram, like growing up, I had this Bible, like this children's Bible with like, pictures on like every 100 pages with like major stories. And so Abram was a part of that. And it was always just a really old dude and his wife, like just the two of them. But reading this again, like, we shouldn't picture Abram as just some like lonely nomad, because he has all these people with him. He has all his stuff. He left the home that he knew, but he also like brought people along with him. And it looks like when you read this that Lot decided to go. Like I don't think Abram invited Lot. Lot just decided to go. But once Lot was with Abram, Abram took responsibility for Lot. That's kind of the way that the tone of the language around Lot is communicated. Like he is caring for him, taking full responsibility for him, because he is a great father. And as we look at his life, he is old and they have no children. And so part of the challenge for Abram and Sarai, like listening to God's promise and blessing, is like, I will make you a great nation. I will bless your descendants. Abram doesn't have any descendants. And so when Lot comes along, there could be in the back of Abram's mind, this is how God is going to bring this about. This promise to bless my descendants, my heritage, my inheritance, my legacy, like it could come through Lot, who was his nephew. And Lot was an orphan. And so there was here, like he needs a father. He needs somebody to care for him. Great. I will be the father that Lot needs. So that could be part of what's going on in this taking of Lot. But he was not just a lonely old man walking in the wilderness. He was he had a significant entourage. So we don't really know why God chose Abram. We also don't really know why God chose to send Abram to Canaan. It's an interesting choice, this land of the promise. And so we don't know, because like it's not where Eden was. It wasn't where God started the humanity project. And so it's just an interesting choice. And we don't really ever get a full picture of why God chose that place. But if you look at Israel geopolitically at the time, like it is a major crossroads for people coming from Egypt and Africa up into the Arabian Peninsula up into Asia, like and Europe. It's a huge, major point in the world. And so God choosing that, like if you think through like strategically, if you want the people to hear about your blessing of this nation, and all the people will have to come through your nation that you chose, that's a great place to be. And so that could be part of why he chose them. There are some major trade routes. There's some major advantages. It is well watered along the Jordan River. There's different things that make it appealing, but it is still an interesting choice. So when Abram arrives there, God appears to him. Before, the word of the Lord came to Abram, and now God appears to him somehow, some kind of theophany, which is a physical appearance of God, not just a voice, not just a vision or a dream, but God appears to Abram and promises to give him this land to this descendants. And the spot where he's speaking could probably have been on high ground where they could have seen a good territorial view of the whole landscape, and to see God's promise and saying, this is yours, explore it, walk around, see what's going on, get to know this land that I'm giving to your descendants. And then Abram's response is great. He builds an altar. And, we are not given any kind of indication that this altar is a altar where he's making a sacrifice for sin. Like sin is still not really something that is explained or atoned for in the Old Testament at this point. So he's making an offering as a sacrifice to worship the Lord and to designate that this place is special. This is where God appeared to Abram. And so when you think about altars in the Old Testament, like that is often one of the main reasons why people built altars, was to create memorials, to create places where they could go and say, this pile of large rocks that were not hewn by any tool. They were naturally formed rocks piled together. This is where Abram experienced the Lord's presence. This is where Jacob wrestled the angel. This is where the people of Israel crossed over the Jordan into the promised land after the Exodus. Like there's those monuments that are placed all throughout as ways to remember. And so so that's what Abraham does. He builds an altar. He then he's instructed to go and explore. And so he finds a place between Bethel and Ai, and he builds his encampment there. And he stays there for a while and then goes toward the Negev. And so we see Abram. He left the land that he knew, went to the land that God had promised. Things seem great. But then in verse 10, we pick up verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And he was about to enter Egypt. He said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarai was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord inflicted serious disease on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. What have you done to me? He asked. Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So famine comes to the land, and Abram does what a rational person would do. And we'll see this is what Abram's descendants do when famine comes. He went to Egypt, and Egypt was a very fertile place. The Nile River was consistent and strong, and it would have irrigated much of the land. And so it's a good place to bring flocks and to take care of the flocks. It's a good place to grow crops. It was a great environment. And one of the weirdest experiences in my life is I've been able to go to Egypt and being on the Nile River. It's one of those things where you're just like, this is a river that was in the Bible. Like this river is a big deal. For my faith, just cool to think through, and then seeing how big it really is. Like the Nile River turns to blood in the Exodus. Like that's a lot of blood in a big old river. And so just really interesting space. And so he goes there to where the water was flowing freely and where there's prosperity. And it's one of those times where we see Abram working in kind of his own wisdom and maybe not fully trusting the Lord. He's leaving the land that God had promised him. And so he leaves, goes to Egypt, and while he's on the way, recognizes his wife is like really beautiful. She's 65 years old. She's breathtaking. He knows that people will want her. And so he has this defensive move to say, tell them you're my sister so that they don't kill me. In doing so, he's actually potentially setting himself up to negotiate a dowry for Sarai if somebody were to say, I want to marry this woman. So he's saving his own neck, setting up a dowry negotiation system, because he knows he doesn't want to stay in Egypt, but he also knows he doesn't want to die. So he comes up with this plan, and it seems like a good plan to Sarai, and so they go for it. And he was right. They do want her. Pharaoh's people like take her to Pharaoh's house. And Pharaoh is also very nice to Abram. So he's already a fairly well-to-do person. He's got all these flocks. He's got all this, these people that have been traveling with him. So he's already well-to-do. And then Pharaoh gives him even more, gives him more flocks, gives him more servants. He like takes care of Abram because he wants to marry Sarai. But the Lord sends a plague, and somehow Pharaoh finds out Abram's scheme. We don't know how. It could have been a dream, because Pharaoh and his people were very spiritual, and so it could have been a dream. It could have been one of Pharaoh's diviners somehow revealing this. It could have even been Sarai saying, "Listen, I need to tell you something. Abram is not my brother. He's my husband." And so that could have been what, like, once everybody started getting sick, Sarai saying, "This is what's going on." So the story doesn't give us all the details and the palace intrigue that goes into this event, but there is a plague that God sends on Pharaoh and his household, and Pharaoh sends Abraham and his entourage back out of the land. So there's a little echo for what's to come in the book of Exodus, where God's people go to Egypt during a plague or a famine. Egypt experiences a bunch of plagues, and Pharaoh finally says, "Fine, go." And so God is kind of, "Yeah, Abram, you tried your thing. I need you to get back to where I need you to be." And so one of the themes throughout Scripture that it's hard to preach unless you know the whole story is like, God will keep pushing you back to where he wants you to be. And it's a lot easier if you just will submit to him and trust him. And so here we have another little indication that that's the case. And part of the just the weird thing about Abram's actions in this story is like, we're not given like a very super clear, like, this was a bad thing Abram did. It just is a story that happens. And so we have to think through, like, why is this story here? What are the moral implications of Abram's decisions? And so here's just one of those times where we're just told Abram did not inquire the Lord. He did his own thing. Stuff happened. He ended up back in the land. All the while, God is still providing for him, because as he leaves, he's wealthier than when he went in. And so God's promise to bless is happening. God's promise to curse people who would work against Abram is also happening, because Pharaoh is working against Abram in trying to take Sarai. So it's a complicated bit of story, but yeah. So let's keep going into chapter 13, and all right. So verse 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, and with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together, and quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan toward Zoar was well watered, and like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. All right, so Lot and Abram are quite wealthy, and this area where they're taking care of their flocks is quite crowded because it's not just Lot and Abram's flocks, it's also two other tribes that are all kind of in the same zone, which is leading to great conflict. And so here, Abram, as I was preparing for this, what struck me is like Abram in the last chapter was kind of trying to control his fate in Egypt. And now he's coming out of Egypt back into the land. And as he's talking with Lot, he actually is surrendering some significant stuff. Because one thing, he's like, all right, we need to separate. He is potentially pushing his heir away, saying, Lot, we need to separate for the good of our family, because we are close relatives. You need to go. So he's getting rid of plan B for the child that he doesn't have, but he's also potentially offering Lot the land that God was promising him. So he's kind of like in this place where he's like letting go of the control of the whole situation. And so they go to the top of the mountain and they look, and the Jordan River flows north to south. At the north end is the Sea of Galilee. At the south end is the Dead Sea. And this the Jordan River was, the land in the southern area of the Jordan River. There's some good fertile land. The Dead Sea is kind of deserty, but at the time we get this indication. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So the original readers of this would have said, like, this is an interesting choice that Lot's making to go there because God destroyed this land. But before that, it could have been even more fertile and even more beautiful. And so Lot goes there, thinking this is the best choice. So in Lot choosing that land, Canaan, the land that God had promised Abram and his descendants, is still available. And so there's this surrendering of control here in Abraham's choice, and like saying, like, I'm going to let this play out. I'm going to trust God in this. And so they part ways. And this is also one of the interesting things, that as they part ways, God appears to Abram again and says, good, look to the land that I have promised. Again, walk the land, know the land, get to see where I am giving the land that I'm giving to you and to your people. And something to note here in Genesis, we're going to start to see the Lord showing up, capital Lord, as one word. And so when you see that in your English translations, that's the translator telling you that is the divine name, Yahweh. And so when we see all caps Lord, Yahweh is starting to be used as the name for Abraham. It could be that God said to him, my name is Yahweh, I am the Lord. But for the readers who are reading this after the exile or after the Exodus, and Moses is compiling this, hearing the divine name, seeing it in the text here, would have been a confirmation to them that Abraham is following the same God we're following. We're in the same line because it's the same name. And so that's just something to note. We're going to see the Lord God more often moving forward. Not every time. In fact, in a few chapters, we're going to see El Elyon, which is the God Most High. And so, yeah, God has many names in the Old Testament. And so we'll get into that as we get into that. So verse 14, so chapter 14, they've separated. They're going into two different places. And so we're going to read that conflict does not stay away for long. Chapter 14, verse 1. At the time when Amraphel was king of Shinar, again, that's where the Tower of Babel was last week, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. These kings went to war against Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these latter kings joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea Valley. For 12 years, they had been subject to Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year, they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him went out and defeated the Rephaites in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzites in Ham, the Emites in Shava, Kiriathaim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran, near the desert. Then they turned back and went to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and they conquered the whole territory of the Amalekites, as well as the Amorites who were living in Hezezon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, marched out and drew up their battle lines in the valley of Siddim against Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. The 4 kings seized all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food. Then they went away. They also carried off Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, since he was living in Sodom. So, 4 kings from the east. The east is where Abram's from. The east is where his family, this is close to Ur and the Chaldean area, Tower of Babel, Shinar, all of this stuff. This is the land that we are familiar with from the history of the people so far. So these 4 kings build a union, an alliance with each other, and they start to conquer, and they start taking over. And these 5 kings that are close to where Abram's family is and Lot's family is, they start conquering, and there's a 12 years of subjugation here. So whether or not Abram and Lot were there for the whole subjugation, not entirely sure, but the writer is giving us some geopolitical intrigue here to help us see that the story of Abram is one story in the larger story of the known world. There's a lot going on. And something that I heard just recently is, I think is helpful for us, is so often we get really focused just in what we're facing right now. But what this writer was saying in this interview was that sometimes we need to remember that our world is not the whole world. And sometimes when we read the Bible, it's helpful to get these bigger pictures to say, Abram's world is not the whole world. There's a lot going on here. And sometimes we find Abram is in the middle of something that he has no control over. But that's our story too. We don't have control over most of the things that are happening in the world. It's good to be aware of what's going on and to respond accordingly. And so when we look at these 4 kingdoms, some of them we can place and some of them might be a little harder to locate. But they come and they do the attack. They attack these 5 kings in particular, these 5 cities, and they win and they subjugate them 12 years. 13th year, they throw a rebellion. In the 14th year, they come back around. These 4 kings come back around to start conquering and expanding the empire even more. And so the tragedy in this story for us, because Abram is not really a part of any of these cities. He's not really a threat. He's not really trying to be anything other than a shepherd, a herder. And so the tragedy here, though, is in Sodom, there's some casualties, some live casualties that are taken out. Lot's family are taken from their home near Sodom. And even though we know right now Sodom is not a good city, and they're wicked, they're sinning against the Lord, but that's where our friend Lot is. So we have to figure out, like, what's going to happen to Lot. So the writer tells us here in the next section, in verse 13. A man who had escaped came and reported this to Abram the Hebrew. Now Abram was living near the great trees of Mamre, the Amorite, a brother of Eshcol and Aner, all of whom were allied with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he called out the 318 trained men born in his household and went in pursuit as far as Dan. During the night, Abram divided his men to attack them, and he routed them, pursuing them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He recovered all the goods and brought back his relative Lot and his possessions, together with the women and the other people. Now, 4 kings attacking the 5 kings, it seems like that would be a lot of people. And so when you read the story and Abram has 318 people, it doesn't seem like a lot to take on 4 kingdoms. But this is 318 people just from his household, trained men who grew up in his household. So somehow Abram has built himself an army, and he knows the land, he knows the territory. And so instead of fighting on the east of Jordan, Abram actually goes north to Dan, which is the farthest point in the land of Canaan. And he attacks there, and it starts just destroying the army of the 4 kings. And so these 318 men, they attack at night. They are somehow really good at warfare. I don't know how, but they win. And Abram liberates the people. And so he sets free the people of all 5 kingdoms, the people of Sodom. He sets them all free, and he comes back to the land after this dramatic mission, and picks up in verse. Oh, one more thing. This is another instance as he crossed into Dan where he's actually leaving the land that God had promised him and heading into what we would call Syria. And so he's crossing over into the land again, out of the land to rescue these folks. And I think it's important to get the writers trying to give us some pictures of the length of the land that God had promised. So down to Egypt, out of the land, to Dan, out of Dan, out of the land. This is the land God had promised. So he goes into enemy territory, gets back his people from Sodom, his family, and we pick up in verse 17. And this is where things get really interesting for the future of people of faith. Verse 17, after Abram returned from defeating Kedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shava, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, El Oyin, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praise be to God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." Then Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. The king of Sodom also said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me to honor Eshcol and Mamre. Let them have their share. So Abram, the liberator, coming back home, meets Sodom, the king of Sodom, and Melchizedek, the king of Salem. And there's an interesting contrast here between Melchizedek and the king of Sodom. Melchizedek brings a meal and a blessing. And when we think about the king of Salem, like he's the priest of God Most High, and he's the king of Salem. Salem is, we're not totally sure if that is or is not Jerusalem, but most scholars that I read lean to Jerusalem. And so he is a king, he's a priest, and he is king, the priest of God Most High. And as we see it later, Abraham says, we're serving the same God, because I also serve God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And so while we don't know anything about Melchizedek other than this passage, like this is it. But he is not a descendant of Abram, but he is also serving the Lord, God Most High. And so it's just a little echo here of the world, the religious world, the spiritual world of this ancient Canaan, the promised land. There's people who, yes, there's idolatry, there's false religions all over the world at the time, but there are people like Melchizedek who are faithful to God Most High. And Abram, when encounters him, like this is like a spiritual kinship of sorts, which is pretty awesome. And in his echo, in his blessing, there's echoes of God's blessing, that he will be blessed by God, that God will deliver his enemies. God will do, like, God is with Abram in all of his work here. And in bringing a meal, he's offering peace, he's offering fellowship, he's offering relationship and time together. And in the response, Abram gives him a tithe, which, the Bible did not invent the concept of the tithe. And there's no reason here for us to think that Abraham was really giving a tithe to Melchizedek because he was like, you are God. Like that. No, he just gives him 10% because he's a priest. And so he tithes. And as a response to God's work in his life, and a response to God's help and protection through this victory over the four kings and the blessing that he's received from Melchizedek, he tithes. And so it's a very interesting just dynamic of relationship and spiritual kinship and worship and honoring God together. Melchizedek, his name means my king is righteous. And so we don't know if it's his real name or just the title that he had. But we'll see in the Psalms, one of the Psalms replies back to, you have made him a king in the order, a priest, eternal priest in the order of Melchizedek. And this will be picked up again in the book of Hebrews, where they'll come back to how Christ is even greater than Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is revered in Scripture because he's just this godly priest who is mysterious, and we don't know a lot about him, but he still honored God, and Abraham honored Melchizedek. And so, like, looking at the role of Jesus, the writer of Hebrews is just helping us to see, like, the Hebrew mind, we looked at Melchizedek as a great person that we should revere and be like respectful for. Jesus existed even before Melchizedek. And so that's just one of those interesting little pieces here. The king of Sodom, though, on the other hand, we have this great dynamic interchange between Melchizedek and Abram. The king of Sodom, though, is kind of a jerk, because he's just like, listen, I just want people, you can have my stuff. Which is interesting, and trying to think through, like, why would he want that? Abram is not trying to be a king. Abram is not trying to set up his own kingdom. But the king of Sodom, if he doesn't have people, he doesn't have a kingdom. And so it may be that he's just trying to protect his status through people. Wealth, you can get back. Wealth can be re-earned. And for a king, the wealth is re-earned through the people. And so, but if you don't have people, you can't earn wealth. So that might be part of what he's thinking. Like, I just want my people, you can have the stuff. But Abram is rejecting all of that. And he is saying, like, I don't want you to think that you made me rich. So he just lets it all go, which sets up this next section very interestingly as we look at chapter 15. And we'll wrap shortly. So, because God has made a promise in 12, he's confirming the promise several times. Abraham's making altars and all kinds of stuff, but he's turning away from power and kingdom building for himself. So what does Abram respond in verse 15:1? After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up to the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Now, after Abram turns away from the wealth and the power of the king of Sodom's people and possessions, the Lord appears to him to remind him, I am your shield. I am your defender. You may look like a great warrior. I will protect you. You may have won, but I was there fighting with you. And I am your great reward. You turned away from all of the wealth and the power, the prestige. I am your reward. And that's nice to hear. But Abram still is like, I am waiting for this kid that you promised. And he's having a very real conversation with God. You promised a son. I have no son. Plan B, Lot, he left. So what's that all about? And now I have, in case I die, I set up an estate plan with a servant, Eliezer from Damascus, which is not uncommon culturally. This was something that people saw, these kinds of contracts established in the ancient world. And so he's like, I'm still waiting. He's probably 85, 90 years old. Like, he's getting up there. He's getting old. And so, like, how's this baby thing going to happen? And God reminds him, I have a plan, and Eliezer's not going to be the guy. Look to the stars. Try to count them. Earlier, the Lord said, if somebody could count the dust, they could count your kids. Here he's saying, if somebody count the stars, they could count your kids. But nobody can count the fullness of the universe, the fullness of the stars. And so, so this is a part of the confirmation for Abram. And it says, Abram trusted the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Faith is something that you have before you do. Like, if you have it, you don't need to, if you have something, you don't need to have the faith that you will have something, because you have it already. Trust is something that you decide and you act upon. It's not just like something you act upon your trust, you act upon your faith. And so Abram is acting upon his faith and trusting the Lord, and that is the righteousness that God is seeing in him. Goes on to say in verse 7, he also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So the Lord is sealing his covenant with Abram here. And throughout the Bible, covenantal theology is usually tied to a sacrifice and a sign. And so Noah, when God makes a covenant, there's a sacrifice from the people, and the sign in the heaven is the rainbow. And here, the sacrifice, like these animals, are cut in half, spread apart, and they are the sacrifice essentially. But the sign of the covenant that is sealing this is essentially the people in these ancient covenants would have to walk between the separated bodies of these animals in a way saying, if I fail to live up to my part of the covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. So that's the semiotics, the sign of what's happening in this event. And Abram may have been familiar with this kind of covenant making, but we're not given all the background in the text, but we have found record of this in other cultures. And so God tells him to do this, and he does this. And then in this vision dream he has, God tells him like the history of the people of the future here for the people of Israel. Like, they're going to go into slavery. They will be mistreated. I will rescue them. You are not going to see this. The promise to fill the land with your descendants, Abram, you're not going to see it, but you're going to trust me anyway. And I promise you this, they will come back into this land. And then in the vision, the smoking pot and the flaming torch pass through the space between the animals. So essentially, God is saying, if I don't do this, may what happened to these animals happen to me. Abram is never asked to walk between the animals. God is promising, God is going to do it. It's all on the Lord in this covenant. And so it's just one more confirmation for Abram that God is doing the work. Abram is trusting the Lord. And so why did it take this long? What is God's timing in all of this is one of the questions. But there's a hint to the timing in this weird little phrase, the waywardness of the Amorites was not yet complete. It could be that the Lord knew the time that he needed to bring discipline and punishment to abolish the Amorites for their wickedness. It wasn't yet, but it was coming. And so God was waiting until that time to then bring the people in to drive out the Canaanites, to drive out the wayward people, the sinful people from the land of the promise. Abram can't do it right now. Yeah, he can defeat 4 kingdoms, but that's not what God is calling Abram to be. He's not a warlord. He's calling him to be a man of faith. And so one other thing in this, and then we'll take some time to ask questions, but in the smoking pot and the flaming torch, there could be a bit of an echo for the future, again, as the Lord leads the people out of Egypt, he leads them with a cloud of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so the presence of God is represented by smoke and fire. And so even here, the presence of God in this one-on-one interaction between between Abraham and Yahweh, smoke and fire. And so God is confirming, God is doing things. Next week, we're going to get into some more opportunities where Abram needs to learn to trust the Lord even more. Like they still don't have a kid. So next week, Sarah has some ideas about how to make this kid thing happen. And that doesn't always work out when we give God our ideas. So that's kind of where we're going next week. So any questions for Genesis 12 through 15? There was a lot that we went through.
I do have a question for you. So based off of history, it's a little over 2,000 years from us to Christ, which understandably a lot of things can happen in between that time where polytheism can come into can thrive. My question is, Abraham, in my mind, was less than 500 years from the flood, from when God made a promise not to do that. And so you only have, in my mind, just Noah's family that inhabits the earth. Where the heck did polytheism come from?
Yeah. That is a good question. If you look to, first of all, Genesis doesn't explain that here. It doesn't tell us where all these gods came from. But when you look at Romans 1, Paul gives us a response. We see in all of creation God's invisible qualities and his majesty. But humanity traded all of those things to worship birds and snakes and things of the earth. And they created the idols. So partly, I have a sneeze. Excuse me. Sorry. So what Paul is arguing is like polytheism comes from us, comes from humanity desiring to worship the things we can see instead of the God who we cannot see. One of the ways I talk about idolatry is it's the search for God stopped short. Like we want to worship something, and as soon as we find something that scratches that itch, more often than not, we're willing to stop there. And so for the people who are looking to worship God, they may have had some kind of supernatural experience. It could have been with a demon, which, demons are real. And so it could have been a supernatural experience with a demon, and the people started worshiping that demon, building idols for that demon. And that's a lot of what was going on as you read through like the history with the judges and the conquest of the land of Canaan in the book of Joshua. There's all kinds of cultures there. Like the main reason for driving them out was their idolatry. And so it comes from our own desire to worship things we can see. Is kind of what Paul tells us. So the timeline, 500 years, doesn't seem like a really long time to develop like a philosophy of religion.
Right.
But it doesn't take long for people to mess up today.
That's true.
Like we are, look at our country. And I'm not going to make a political statement here. All right. Our country is 240 something years old, 260 years old. Math is not my strong suit. Our country's not that old. The founders of our country said, intentionally were saying, do not idolize politics and policies. Mm-hmm. And one of the major challenges in our 200 plus years is we are already, as Americans, idolizing politicians.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't take long for people to make idols. So
fair enough.
Sure that.
Yeah. Does that help? Like, that's a really good question. And a philosophy of religion, or history of uh, religious movements, is fascinating.
Mhm.
The text doesn't get into it, but like even looking at cults in our own day, like they start fast.
They do.
They move quickly. So
It
yeah.
does answer my question. I appreciate that. It's just, to me, thinking about how you read, like we're reading through Genesis, and how long lived people are up until this point. Like I imagine that when you're with God, I mean Noah lived 500 years, right? Like
Mhm.
I imagine that I just imagine that it would be hard to create this when people were that long lived. Whereas now it's like we have such short lives, and we don't think the same way that we did during that time. To me, it was just one of those things where it's like how do you fall so quickly when God's there? Right now, God could walk among us and we wouldn't think twice of it. But then in that time, it was like God was there and you knew it. At least that's the way I see it.
Yeah. Well, some people knew him.
Mhm.
Some people walked with the Lord, um, but not everybody did. That's why
Yeah.
the flood happened, was because of the wickedness of the people. And Noah was rescued. The only indication we have is because he walked with the Lord. So we have, it could be through the confusion of languages after Babel. People started isolating, getting confused, doing their own thing. There's a lot that can happen as people separate too. So,
Good
because the
point.
people who could have had some kind of contact with Noah, like they can't talk to Noah anymore, or can't talk to Noah's descendants anymore, because they don't speak the same language. So
I didn't
there's
think about that.
there's a lot going on. There's a lot happening, and so like we just get one thread in Genesis that doesn't tell us the whole story of the world, but it is telling us God's plan for redemption throughout the story of the world. So there's
Yeah.
all like this story's going on, and there's stuff happening all over the place that we don't see. But yeah, it's super interesting. It's fascinating stuff. So yeah. Any other questions?
No.
Jason, I don't really have a question, but I just a comment, something that struck me when we were reading in 15, when God took Abram outside
Mm-hmm.
to have him look up to the heavens, that he literally took him outside, but I was struck by how figuratively he tried to take him outside his own thinking, to encourage him to think bigger, uh, and not just maybe worry about his own problem of being childless. It's like, look at the big picture that I'm trying to paint for you. And that just really struck me.
Mm. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really great. Um, I love astronomy. A couple of years ago, I did a series at Advent about stars. Maybe it was last year. 2020 is a total blur. So this may have been last year. I talked a lot about stars at Advent one point, um, because the universe is amazing. And like what we can see from Earth is overwhelming. But then you get like these composite images that are coming from the Hubble Space Telescope. And it's just like, all of that is out there. And like, yeah, it's like the big picture, like God made all that. And if God can make all of that, Abram, why are you so worried about one kid? like I got this. And yeah, I took an astronomy class in high school because I heard it was easy, and it was. But one of the things my astronomy teacher said was the universe is always expanding. And like there's question, like this theory comes from like the fact that like you can measure like light and distance and all kinds of stuff. And so the theory is that the universe is always expanding. And even if the universe is always expanding, as we understand God, like God is still bigger than the universe. and it's not even done expanding yet. God is still bigger than that. So when Melchizedek says he serves God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and Abram is like, I also serve God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. Like the idea of heaven and earth that they had in mind was even smaller than what we know about heaven and earth. But God is still bigger than that. So yeah, awesome stuff. Kathy, that was a great point. Like, get out of your small thinking, go outside. REI is onto something. Go outside. So, all right. Any other questions? Thoughts? No? All right. We went through a lot tonight, a lot of stuff. And so, yeah, if you do have questions, then please be sure to let me know. I started a Facebook group. I don't know if everybody's on Facebook. I don't know if it's going to be useful, but I'll include the link in the response email that I'll send out tomorrow with the video and the notes and stuff. But if you have questions throughout the week too, like that could be a great place to throw your questions, and we start a little dialogue in the group as well. You know, Facebook's not the best place to get into in-depth conversations, but sometimes it's a good place to process. So like, if we recognize that those kinds of forums are process spaces, not declarative spaces, like where we're like, question, response, and we can be nice and friendly to each other, and we don't say like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, then it could be really helpful. So just so heads up, I'll send that link out. And if we're not already friends on Facebook, and you are okay being friends with me, send me a friend request, because I like friends. But yeah, let's, because this group is different than a lot of groups, and it's not as much time to like dialogue, but I'm also open to dialoguing throughout the week. So yeah, but if there are no other questions or comments, then I see Jay is reaching. Yes, Jay.
You got me. One last question.
Mhm.
And this is just about one thing that I've noticed through, like, in Genesis, is that anytime famine hits the land, everybody goes to Egypt. And so it makes, looking at Egypt right now, it's a freaking desert. But I wonder, during that time, was it nice? I know that you were talking about it, but like, was it nice during that period of time? And then like after slavery and everything like that, God cursed the land so that it forever then on was just kind of like, okay, now it's just a wasteland, except for whenever the Nile raises.
Yeah. I don't know if we see God ever like cursing in Egypt away, like destroying the land, because it is a major political empire throughout the biblical history. So there's people there, but they do experience their own famine in Genesis. So like, it's not a perfect utopia of agriculture. So they do have their own struggles. But one of the things, like when we look at modern Egypt, the people actually moved the Nile at one point. They did a lot of terraforming of Egypt that probably dramatically shaped the ecology. So like what we see as the Nile River is not exactly the same as the Nile River that was talked about in Exodus, but it is a very heavily populated place too, all along the Nile. And so where people are, pollution and waste and all kinds of stuff. So when you go to Cairo in particular, it's like, it doesn't look like a place anybody would really want to live. Like, it is pretty polluted. All the buildings are brown, and they do not start brown. They're just dirty. They're just dirty and sandy and polluted, and it's just like, yuck. But it is an interesting, amazing place. I would go back tomorrow. The coolest thing, and just funny story, I went and saw the pyramids and the Sphinx. These are things that are thousands of years old. Amazing. And you go to the Sphinx and you turn around and look behind you. Across the street from the Sphinx is a Pizza Hut. So Egypt has changed. It's a different place. So yeah, that was a weird thing. Like, Pizza Hut. All right.
And that is the riddle of the Sphinx.
What's that?
And that is the riddle of the Sphinx.
Yeah. That's, I was like, what am I going to get today? That's what he's thinking. The meat lover supreme. So, yeah. All right. Well, okay. Let me pray for us, and I'll send us out into a beautiful Wednesday in the nice dry time before it rains for the next months. So, Lord, we thank you for the example of our father Abraham. And while we are brought into the family through Jesus, we share his example of faith. So, Lord, I pray for us as we are facing big decisions. And even as Kathy shared, sometimes we get really focused on the small stuff that we're dealing with. And so, Lord, I pray that you would help us to see that you are in control of the big picture. And even when our world feels like it's out of our control, Lord, you are still God. You are still in control. And Lord, help us to trust you. And so I pray that you keep us safe, that you would watch over us as we go to work, as we are with our families, as we're dealing with school stuff and all kinds of different ins and outs of our day-to-day. Help us to look for your bigness in all the small things too. For your glory, Lord. Amen. Amen. All right.